Imagine you're at a coffee shop on a quiet Sunday morning in late November 2009, just trying to wake up and mentally prepare for work. That's exactly what four Lakewood police officers were doing at a Forza coffee shop in Parkland, Washington. They weren't in hot pursuit of bad guys or cracking big cases. They were simply grabbing some caffeine and catching a breather before their shift. But what started as an ordinary morning turned into one of the most shocking and heartbreaking events in Washington's law enforcement history. Those four officers, Sergeant Mark Renninger and Officers Ronald Owens, Tina Griswold, and Gregory Richards, never got the chance to leave that coffee shop. A man named Morris Clemens walked in and opened fire in what can only be called calculated ambush. The officers didn't even have time to react. But in a moment of incredible bravery, Officer Richards managed to draw his weapon and return fire, injuring Clemens before succumbing to his own injuries. That one shot would play a huge role in how the next couple of days unfolded. Now, who exactly was this Clemens guy? Oh, just your average walking red flag with a criminal record that stretched back to the 1980s. He had a long history of violent offenses in Arkansas and somehow kept slipping through the cracks. Most controversially, he had actually been granted clemency years earlier by then-Governor Mike Huckabee. Yep, that decision came back to haunt the political world big time. At the time of the shooting, Clemens was out on bail for multiple charges and had been acting erratically, making threats and talking nonsense about divine missions and law enforcement. After the shooting, all hell broke loose. Authorities launched a massive manhunt that involved hundreds of officers, roadblocks, helicopters, and tip lines that never stopped ringing. It was an all-out scramble to track this guy down. For nearly 2 days, Clemens managed to stay one step ahead of the cops, using safe houses, changing locations, and relying on a small group of friends and relatives who were foolish enough to help him hide. But eventually, the law caught up. On December 1st, a Seattle police officer spotted a suspicious vehicle parked on a quiet street. When Clemens showed up nearby, the officer recognized him, gave him a command to stop, and Clemens made one final, fatal move. The officer opened fire and took him down, ending one of the most intense manhunts the state had ever seen. The aftermath of the shooting was massive. The community was in shock. Thousands of people came out to mourn the officers, hold vigils, and support their families. Donations poured in. Streets were lined with flags, and people who had never even met the victims felt like they had lost someone close. It was that kind of moment heartbreaking, unifying, unforgettable. At the same time, people started asking some very serious questions. How could someone with Clemens' history still be walking free? What does this say about our bail system, our parole system, and the policies that are supposed to keep dangerous individuals behind bars? The shooting sparked a storm of debates and reforms in law enforcement and the justice system that continue to echo today. So, yeah, what started as a quiet morning coffee run became a moment that changed lives, policies, and a community forever. A tragic reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary places, history shows up uninvited. It was a quiet Monday morning in November 2024. In East Charlotte, North Carolina, people were starting their day. A team of officers had gathered outside a house on Galway Drive, preparing to serve an arrest warrant on 39-year-old Terry Clark Hughes. Hughes was no ordinary suspect. He was a felon, wanted for illegal firearm possession and fleeing law enforcement. Twice. The officers knew there was risk. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force was on the scene, a team of highly trained officers from different agencies, including Samuel Pelos and William Elliott from the North Carolina Department of Corrections, Thomas Weeks, a deputy U.S. Marshal, and Joshua A., a respected officer with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. They had done this before. They were trained for moments like this. As the officers approached the house, a deafening crack rang out, then another, then chaos. Hughes wasn't waiting to be arrested. He was armed, waiting, and he had a high-powered rifle. Bullets ripped through the morning air as he fired relentlessly from inside the house, over 100 rounds tearing through the scene in seconds. Pelos and Elliot were the first to fall. They hit the ground hard as their colleagues rushed to save them. But there was no time. Hughes kept firing, and before anyone could regain control, Weeks and Joshua A. were down too. A neighbor, Sing Chan, found himself trapped outside his home in the chaos. He held up his phone, recording, his voice trembling as he pleaded with officers to help him get inside. But there was no time for that, no safe way in. The officers told him to get away, to find cover anywhere he could. The gunfight raged for hours, bullets ripping through the walls of nearby homes, sirens wailing as backup arrived. And then, finally, it ended. Hughes was dead, but so were 4 officers. Joshua A. had served Charlotte for 6 years, dedicating himself to public safety with quiet strength. He was also a first-class sergeant in the North Carolina Army National Guard. His loss hit hardest at home. His wife, Ashley, and their 3-year-old son, Andrew, left behind to navigate a world without him. At his memorial service, held at First Baptist Church in uptown Charlotte, a horse-drawn carriage carried his body through the streets. Hundreds lined the sidewalks, waving flags, saluting, holding back tears. Inside the church, Ashley spoke through grief, sharing memories of the man she loved. Their son, too young to fully understand, waved at a picture of his father, a heartbreaking image that seared into the hearts of those who watched. Samuel Pelos had served 14 years with the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction, working in special operations and intelligence. He left behind a wife and 2 children who would now have to face life without him. William Elliott, another 14-year veteran, was known for his meticulous work and devotion to public safety. His wife and young child survived him, but their world would never be the same. Thomas Weeks had spent 13 years with the U.S. Marshals Service after previously working in Customs and Border Protection. He was a loving husband and a father of 4 children who would never again hear their father's voice. In total, 8 officers had been shot that day. Some survived, but survival didn't mean they were unscathed. CMPD officers Chris T., Michael Giglio, Jack Blowers, and Joshua Campbell made it out, but their wounds, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. Statesville Police Corporal Casey Hoover, another officer injured in the ambush, was expected to recover, but the scars of this day would never truly fade. The city mourned. The law enforcement community grieved, but beneath the sorrow, questions lingered. How did this happen? Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? One thing was certain. Officers Pelos, Elliot, Weeks, and Joshua A. made the ultimate sacrifice. They ran toward danger when the rest of the world would have run away. Their names would not be forgotten, their stories not erased. They left behind families, colleagues, and a city that would forever bear the weight of that morning in November. Their courage, their dedication, and their final moments would stand as a testament to what it means to serve, no matter the cost. On the night of July 7th, 2016, what began as a peaceful protest in downtown Dallas quickly turned into one of the deadliest attacks on American law enforcement in recent memory. The protest itself had been organized in response to the recent police shootings of 2 black men, Alton Sterling in Louisiana and Philando Castile in Minnesota. Across the U.S., tensions were high. Communities were grieving, angry, and demanding justice. But in Dallas that evening, the atmosphere was calm. People marched through the streets, voices raised not in chaos but in hope, calling for change. But then, everything shattered. Wrapping up and people were starting to head home, Micah Xavier Johnson, a 25-year-old Army Reserve veteran, emerged from the crowd. Armed with a rifle and wearing tactical gear, Johnson began firing on police officers with alarming precision. In the chaos that followed, 5 officers were killed and 9 others were injured, along with 2 civilians. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Sirens blaring, people running for cover, officers scrambling to locate the shooter. Johnson wasn't acting randomly. According to reports, he had specifically targeted white police officers. His actions were fueled by anger over the treatment of black Americans by police, and he made it clear both in his actions and in later negotiations with the police, that this was retaliation. But this wasn't just rage. It was calculated. Johnson had received military training, and it showed. He moved tactically, took cover, and even ambushed officers by firing from behind pillars and walls. At one point, he cornered and fatally shot an officer at close range. The situation turned into a tense standoff inside El Centro College, where Johnson had holed up. For hours, police tried to negotiate with him, attempting to bring the situation to a peaceful end. But Johnson refused to surrender, continuing to fire and threatening to do more harm. After exhausting all other options, the Dallas Police Department made a decision that would make history. They sent in a robot armed with explosives to neutralize him. This marked the first time in U.S. history that law enforcement used a robot to kill a suspect. The explosion killed Johnson and ended the standoff, but the damage had already been done. The city and the nation was left reeling. 5 officers gone, many others wounded, and a community left trying to make sense of the violence. President Obama called it a vicious, calculated, and despicable attack, and cities around the country increased police presence at public events, unsure of what might come next. In the aftermath, people struggled to reconcile the tragedy. The protest had been peaceful. The message had been justice, fairness, accountability. Johnson's actions had twisted that message into something else entirely, something dark and violent. His attack didn't bring people together. It deepened divides. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had nothing to do with the attack, was unfairly blamed in some circles, and the conversation about police reform got even more complicated. Looking back, the 2016 Dallas police ambush wasn't just a horrific event, it was a turning point. It forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about race, violence, and justice in America. It showed us how quickly a peaceful demand for change could be overshadowed by a single act of hate. And while Dallas has continued to heal, that night remains a painful reminder of how fragile progress can be, and how important it is to protect the spaces where people come together, not tear them apart. The morning of April 3, 2019, was bitterly cold in Hampton, Maine. Detective Ben Campbell, a respected Maine State Police officer, went about his shift. At just 31 years old, he was known for his dedication and his compassion. He had a young family, a wife, Hillary, and their 6-month-old son, Everett. That morning, as he patrolled Interstate 95, he noticed a vehicle stranded on the side of the road. The driver was in trouble. He pulled over without hesitation, stepping out of his cruiser to help. It was a routine act of kindness, something he had done countless times before. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A logging truck rumbled past. No one saw it coming. No one had time to react. 2 massive wheels suddenly detached from the truck. One rolled harmlessly into the median. The other barreled straight toward Ben. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, fighting to save him, but the injuries were too severe. At Northern Light Eastern Maine Medical Center, the news no one wanted to hear was confirmed. Ben was gone. The shock spread like wildfire. His death was first called a tragic accident, but the truth was more painful. An investigation revealed the wheels had been improperly secured. Negligence had played a role, yet no criminal charges were filed. The inspector responsible was given only a 6-month suspension. At his funeral, thousands gathered. Law enforcement officers from across the U.S. and even Canada stood shoulder to shoulder. The Cross Insurance Arena in Portland, filled with grief, echoed with tributes to a man who had given everything. Colonel John Coate captured the heartbreak. Not stopping would have never entered Ben's mind. He had lived his life with a purpose: to serve, to protect, to help. That instinct, the very thing that made him extraordinary, had led him to that roadside. His wife, Hillary, stood before the crowd, her voice trembling but strong. She spoke of their love, their life together, and the promises they had made. She vowed to raise their son with the same kindness and courage his father had shown. For her, Ben had been a hero long before that day. The pain of his loss did not fade. 2 years later, Maine still honored him. Flags were lowered in his name. His sacrifice became a call to action, a reminder of the dangers officers face and the deadly consequences of negligence. The roads remained treacherous. Trucking accidents, often caused by carelessness and improper maintenance, continued to claim lives. How many could have been prevented? How many more families would have to suffer? Ben Campbell should have gone home that day. He should have held his son, kissed his wife, and laughed with his friends. But fate and failure stole that from him. His story is not just one of loss, but of a lesson, a reminder that responsibility, vigilance, and simple acts of care can mean the difference between life and death. He will never be forgotten, and in his name, the fight for safer roads, for better accountability, and for those who serve continues. On January 6, 2021, something happened in Washington, D.C. that shook the very foundations of American democracy. The United States Capitol, the iconic building where laws are made and the peaceful transfer of power is symbolized, became the scene of an unprecedented and alarming event. That day, thousands of supporters of then-President Donald Trump gathered for a rally near the National Mall, energized by weeks of claims that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen. Despite no credible evidence supporting these claims, the crowd was fired up by Trump's speech that morning, where he urged them to fight like hell to challenge the election results. As Congress was meeting inside to formally certify Joe Biden's victory, the rally quickly escalated. The crowd surged toward the Capitol building, breaching security barriers and overwhelming the police. What followed was chaos. Rioters broke windows, smashed doors, and stormed inside, forcing lawmakers to evacuate or hide in secure locations. It was a terrifying breach of a place that represents the core of American governance, carried out by people who believed they were defending their country, though their actions actually threatened the democratic process. The violence and destruction led to multiple injuries among law enforcement and rioters, and tragically several deaths were linked to the events that day. The images of rioters wandering the halls of Congress, waving flags, and sitting in the Speaker's office shocked the world. For many, it was hard to believe that something like this could happen in the United States. In the aftermath, the Capitol riot became a national crisis. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies scrambled to respond, and the National Guard was deployed to restore order. The event sparked widespread condemnation from political leaders across the spectrum, and it led to the second impeachment of President Trump, who was charged with inciting the insurrection. Though he was later acquitted by the Senate, the damage to the country's political landscape was undeniable. Investigations into the riot uncovered how failures in security planning contributed to the breach, and how some individuals inside and outside government may have played roles in encouraging or enabling the attack. The House of Representatives formed a select committee to dig deeper into what happened and to recommend ways to prevent such an event from ever happening again. The Capitol riot was more than just a violent protest. It was a direct attack on democracy itself. It exposed deep divisions in American society and showed how dangerous misinformation and distrust in institutions can become when mixed with political passion. As the country continues to heal and reflect on that day, the hope remains that lessons will be learned and safeguards will be strengthened to protect the peaceful transfer of power, the very heart of democratic rule. The summer heat hung heavy over Washington, D.C. that August day as Officer Wayne David, a 25-year veteran, set out on what would be his final shift. He had dedicated his life to keeping illegal guns off the streets, but in a cruel twist of fate, one would take his own. But this day would be different. It started early that morning when officers spotted a man acting strangely near a parked car. Something about him didn't sit right. Moments later, he tossed a firearm into a storm drain and took off on a motorcycle, disappearing into the city's streets. Wayne was the best at what he did. Firearm retrieval was his specialty. When his team got word of the discarded gun, there was no hesitation. Wayne would handle it. Then, in a split second, everything changed. A gunshot. The impact was instant. Wayne collapsed. Blood pooled beneath him as his fellow officers rushed to his side. Sirens screamed through the streets as they raced to the hospital. But deep down, they all knew. By the time they arrived, there was nothing the doctors could do. Wayne David, beloved officer, father, fiancé, friend, was gone. The hunt for the man responsible began immediately. Authorities released the name Tyrell Lamont Bailey, 27 years old, dreadlocks, last seen in a white t-shirt and blue shorts. He had abandoned his shoes in his desperate escape, vanishing into the streets, trying to outrun the weight of what had just happened. A $60,000 reward was posted for any information leading to his arrest. The search for Bailey stretched on for a week. Then, suddenly, it was over. He walked into the 7th District Police Station and turned himself in. No dramatic chase, no last-minute escape. Just a man who had run as far as he could, only to realize there was nowhere left to go. He was charged with carrying a pistol without a license, but the weight of Wayne's death hung heavy. Prosecutors reviewed every angle, deciding what came next. More details surfaced. Bailey had a history with guns, offenses dating back to 2017. That day, after tossing the weapon, he had fled so fast he had to abandon his shoes. He had flagged down a stranger on a motorcycle, claiming he had been robbed, convincing the man to take him to Maryland. The rider had no idea who he was helping until he saw the news later. At Wayne's funeral, the weight of his loss was unbearable. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser and MPD Chief Pamela A. Smith stood among the sea of blue uniforms, paying tribute to a man. The investigation into his death continued. There were questions that haunted those left behind. Could it have been prevented? Had the system failed him? What if the gun had been handled differently? What if it had never been on the streets to begin with? Wayne David's death was more than a tragedy, because Wayne wasn't just another fallen officer. He was a protector, a father, a friend, and the city he loved would never forget him. In early 1993, a small rural compound just outside Waco, Texas, became the center of one of the most intense and tragic standoffs in modern U.S. history. This was the Mount Carmel Center, home to the Branch Davidians, a religious group led by a man named David Koresh. What began as a federal raid over alleged firearms violations quickly escalated into a 51-day siege that would end in flames, controversy, and the deaths of 76 people, including many women and children. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, was a charismatic and controversial figure who claimed to be the final prophet of the Branch Davidians, a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He preached apocalyptic messages, amassed a loyal group of followers, and was believed to be stockpiling weapons inside the compound. There were also disturbing allegations of child abuse and polygamy, with Koresh reportedly taking multiple spiritual wives, some of them minors. Federal authorities took notice. On February 28, 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, launched a raid to serve a search warrant and arrest Koresh. But things didn't go as planned. The Davidians were tipped off, possibly by a local news crew asking for directions, and when agents approached, gunfire erupted. A fierce firefight left 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. With the raid a disaster, the FBI quickly took over. What followed was a tense, drawn-out siege that lasted 51 days. The FBI used a mix of negotiation and psychological pressure tactics, including blaring loud music and harsh lights at night, cutting off power and supplies, and even using tanks to crush perimeter fences. Meanwhile, Koresh remained inside, refusing to surrender or release many of his followers. Negotiations led to the release of some children, but dozens of people, including Koresh, stayed inside. As the weeks dragged on, pressure mounted. On April 19, 1993, the FBI launched what it called a final effort to end the siege. Using tanks, they began pumping tear gas into the buildings to force the Davidians out. Hours later, fires broke out inside the compound. The flames spread rapidly, and within minutes the entire building was engulfed. 76 people died in the fire, including David Koresh. Only a handful of people made it out alive. The exact cause of the fire remains disputed. The government maintained that the Davidians set the fires themselves, while survivors and critics argued that the FBI's tactics triggered the blaze. The use of force, the siege strategy, and the tragic outcome sparked intense controversy and multiple investigations. The Waco siege left a deep scar on American law enforcement history and became a flashpoint for anti-government sentiment. It inspired books, documentaries, and public debate, and even played a role in radicalizing individuals like Timothy McVeigh, who cited Waco as a major reason behind the Oklahoma City bombing 2 years later. Today, Waco remains a powerful symbol of mistrust between some citizens and the federal government. The events of 1993 are a sobering reminder of what can happen when ideology, suspicion, and heavy-handed tactics collide in a high-stakes standoff. It was a sunny day of September 2024 in Queensland, Australia. It was a day for the annual Wall-to-Wall Ride for Remembrance, a solemn yet powerful event where officers from across the country rode in honor of their fallen comrades. Among them was Senior Sergeant Brendan Wiblin, a man who had dedicated 28 years of his life to the Queensland Police Service. The journey had begun in Brisbane, hundreds of riders forming a long procession of flashing badges, all united in one purpose: to remember. Brendan was among them. The final destination was Canberra, where they would stand together on National Police Remembrance Day, paying tribute to those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. But Brendan would never make it to Canberra. At around 3:20 p.m., as the riders made their way near Glen Innes, New South Wales, something went wrong. Brendan moved to overtake another rider, but in a sudden, he lost control. His motorcycle veered off the road, the tires skidding helplessly against the asphalt before the bike plunged down an embankment. Fellow riders slammed on their brakes, rushing to his side. Bystanders ran forward. CPR was performed desperately as they willed him to hold on, but the injuries were too severe. By the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing more that could be done. Brendan was gone. The news spread like wildfire, sending a wave of grief through the Queensland Police Service and beyond. This was a ride meant to honor the fallen, but now, in the cruelest twist, it had claimed another life. Assistant Commissioner Brian Swan struggled to find the words, echoing the heartbreak felt by Brendan's colleagues and friends. He spoke of the loss, the shock, the way the entire police family now stood united in grief. Queensland Police Commissioner Steve Golszowski called it devastating. Brendan had died in an event meant to honor those lost before him. How could they make sense of that? For those who had worked with him on the Gold Coast, it was unfathomable. He wasn't just a colleague. He was the one who always had their backs, the one who brought sharp wit and unwavering dedication to every shift. The pain reached beyond the police force. The riders who had shared the road with him year after year were left reeling. Brendan had been there to remember his fallen friend, and now they would have to remember him. Shane Pryor, president of the Queensland Police Union, spoke of Brendan's loyalty, his integrity, the way he had always been the first to step up for others. He wasn't just riding to honor the fallen, he was one of them now. Despite the overwhelming grief, the ride continued. It had to. Brendan's family made sure of it. His son, Liam, who had ridden beside him in past years, was shattered but resolute. His father would have wanted them to keep going, to finish the journey in his name. As the riders reached Armidale, they paused, heads bowed, joined by New South Wales police officers in solemn tribute. But the journey wasn't over. They pressed on toward Canberra, carrying Brendan's spirit with them. Tributes poured in from every direction. Bianca Stone, a Gold Coast political candidate, shared her heartbreak, calling Brendan a great man. As the days passed, the grief didn't fade, but the support never wavered. The riders completed their journey. They arrived in Canberra, standing shoulder to shoulder on National Police Remembrance Day, knowing they had lost one of their own along the way. On the morning of July 17, 2016, the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, was still reeling from the recent police shooting of Alton Sterling, a 37-year-old black man whose death had sparked national outrage. Protests and public frustration were high, and tension between police and the community was palpable. Then, in a devastating turn of events, that tension exploded into tragedy. Shortly before 9 a.m., a man dressed in black and armed with a semi-automatic rifle and multiple other weapons began moving through a commercial area near a gas station and car wash. The man was Gavin Eugene Long, a 29-year-old former U.S. Marine from Kansas City, Missouri. Long wasn't just passing through, he had come to Baton Rouge with a mission, one that would end in violence and death. A 911 call had been made about a suspicious person in the area. Officers responded, unaware that it was a deliberate trap. Long ambushed them, using tactical movements and cover to his advantage. Within minutes, 6 law enforcement officers were shot. 3 were killed: Montrell Jackson, Matthew Gerald, and Brad Garafola, and 3 others were injured, 1 critically. Witnesses described the scene as chaotic and terrifying, with rapid gunfire echoing through the area and people running for safety. Police rushed to contain the situation. A gun battle broke out as officers attempted to neutralize the threat. Eventually, a SWAT officer shot and killed Long, ending the deadly encounter. But the damage had already been done. Baton Rouge had just experienced one of the most violent attacks on law enforcement in recent U.S. history. Investigations soon revealed that Long had carefully planned the ambush. He had driven to Baton Rouge days earlier, rented a car, and scouted the area. He recorded videos expressing his views angry, militant, and filled with anti-government and anti-police rhetoric. He saw himself as a vigilante, calling for violent action in response to police brutality. Though he claimed to act alone, he cited groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement and seemed to embrace an ideology centered around black nationalism and armed resistance. The ambush came just 10 days after a similar attack in Dallas, where 5 officers were killed during a protest. The Baton Rouge shooting further inflamed an already fragile national mood. It wasn't just another act of violence. It was part of a disturbing pattern where lone gunmen were taking matters into their own hands in the most destructive way possible. The aftermath of the attack left Baton Rouge shaken. The community mourned not just the officers who died, but the deepening divide between police and the people they serve. Officer Montrell Jackson, one of the victims, had actually written a heartfelt Facebook post days before his death, expressing the pain of being both black and a police officer during such a turbulent time. His words resonated across the country. "I'm tired, physically and emotionally. I swear to God I love this city, but I wonder if this city loves me." Long's actions were condemned across the board by activists, political leaders, and citizens alike. They did not represent a movement or a cause. They represented a breaking point in a single individual, whose path to violence did nothing to bring about justice or change. Instead, it deepened wounds and made it harder for communities and police to rebuild trust. The 2016 Baton Rouge police ambush stands as a sobering reminder of the consequences of escalating rhetoric, unchecked anger, and violence masked as justice. Claimed heroes and left a scar on a city that was already hurting. It was May 26, 2022, a day that should have been just another routine training session at the Los Angeles Police Academy in Elysian Park. This was where officers honed their skills, where recruits learned the ropes, and where experienced cops like 32-year-old Houston Tipping pushed themselves to be better. Tipping was no rookie. He was a 5-year LAPD veteran, known for his dedication and hard work. He patrolled Devonshire and even served as a bike instructor, always striving to help his fellow officers. But that day, something went terribly wrong. During a grappling exercise, Tipping was paired with another officer. The move seemed simple enough. One officer locked the other in a bear hug before both went to the ground. But when they fell, something snapped. Tipping suffered a catastrophic spinal cord injury, and just like that, his life was slipping away. He was rushed to Los Angeles County USC Medical Center, but the damage was too severe. 3 days later, on May 29th, he was gone. LAPD Chief Michael Moore called it a tragic accident. At the funeral, he spoke of Tipping as a man who went the extra mile to make the world a better place. But behind the condolences and formal statements, something didn't sit right. Not with Tipping's mother, Shirley Huffman, not with the people who knew him, and certainly not with attorney Brad Gage, who believed this wasn't an accident at all, but something far more sinister. According to Gage, Tipping had been investigating a case involving 4 LAPD officers. A serious case. A case that, if exposed, could ruin careers. One of the officers named in the report. He was there that day. He was in the training session. The dots were too clear to ignore. And as more details surfaced, the tragedy of Houston Tipping's death twisted into something darker, something that smelled like a cover-up. The autopsy told a chilling story. Tipping's injuries weren't just from a fall. 3 broken ribs, a lacerated liver, subdural hematomas, and a spinal cord so damaged it sealed his fate. The LAPD claimed a mechanical CPR device had caused the rib fractures, but Gage wasn't buying it. Medical records showed no sign the device had even been used. Even worse, an MRI revealed staples in his head injuries that hadn't been accounted for. If this was just an accident, why did it look so much like a beating? Then came the biggest red flag of all. There was no video footage. The LAPD insisted the training session hadn't been recorded. Convenient. Too convenient. Training sessions were usually documented, yet somehow this one wasn't. Without footage, there was no way to verify their story, no way to confirm what really happened in that room. And so, the questions mounted. If Tipping was getting close to exposing something, could his death have been a warning, a message? Was this training session a setup designed to intimidate or worse, eliminate a man who knew too much? The LAPD, of course, denied everything. They called it an accident. They promised an internal review. But for Huffman, for Gage, and for those who saw the cracks in the story, that wasn't enough. Houston Tipping was more than a patrol officer, more than a bike instructor, more than just another name on a report. His family and friends spoke of his kindness, his dedication to helping others. Even in death, he gave life, his organs donated to those in need, a final act of selflessness. But his own story, that remains unfinished. Was Officer Houston Tipping the victim of a tragic accident or something far worse? The truth is still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And until it is, one question lingers. What really happened inside that training room?